8,000 works that celebrate Detroit artists, and so we are thrilled to be bringing us all together to talk about art in the collection. We have an exhibition on the second floor of the Elaine Jacobs Gallery. If you haven't seen it after our talk, please go over there. And on the second floor, this exhibition titled Origins really looks at the impact that Detroit has had on Detroit artists, and the alternative press is the center of this exhibition. Our student, Jakira Ahmed, undergraduate art history student, became smitten with the alternative press when she was inventorying work that was donated from artist Gary Alenko and the estate of John and Christine Pyatt and John Egner. And she spent all last summer working on a fellowship where she researched and wrote and curated the exhibition about alternative press. Also, I wanted to, not only is this exhibition important in looking at the history of Detroit, but it's also important to look at the impact that the alternative press is still having today and its relevance. So I think it's impacting Jakira and so many more people. There's one, besides Jakira, I would also like to thank our staff, Daniel Sperry, Tom Przewski, Laura McCarr for mounting this beautiful exhibition and all their hard work, and for our dean, Hassan Elahi, for the support that he gives us. But also the person I want to talk about tonight who made this event possible is not here. My dear friend Ruth Ratner established an endowment to create awareness around this collection. And so we are able to bring you all together tonight to talk about the collection and to talk about an aspect of the collection. But when I emailed Ruth to invite her to this event, she said, I may not be here, but I'm so proud of the work you are doing. And it's just like Ruth to always be lifting us all up. Ruth was a huge supporter of Detroit art. When she received her Arts Achievement Award last year, the few words that she spoke was support Detroit art, and that's what she did. And with this endowment, not only does she continue to support Detroit art, but this university and all of our lives will be impacted again and again. So without further ado, I want to introduce a colleague of mine. Her name is Stephanie Williams, and she is the Senior Director of the Wayne State University Press.
What a wonderful evening, and how terrific to see so many people come out for print culture, for art, for this amazing city and this amazing part of the city. In 1974, the man who saw the best minds of his generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull. One Allen Ginsberg said in 1974, Detroit's alternative press products will outlast the auto industry.
Wow.
In many ways, they did. In the spring of 2026, Wayne State University Press will proudly publish Detroit's alternative press, Dispatches from the Avant Garage, by tonight's speaker, Rebecca Kosick. To receive a publication notice, please sign the clipboard that's outside of this room, and we will let you know when it is available. Rebecca grew up in Michigan. She is currently senior lecturer and co-director of the Bristol Poetry Institute at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. She is the author of a monograph, Material Poetics in Hemispheric America, Words and Objects, 1950 to 2010, and a poetry collection called Labor Day. She has also published numerous articles and essays addressing poetry and art in the Americas, along with her own poetry and translations from Spanish and Portuguese in academic and literary journals. I am meeting her for the first time here tonight, but please join me in welcoming Rebecca Kosick.
Hopefully, is that good? Can you hear me? Yeah. Too loud? Good. So I'm going to do the boring part first and talk a little bit about my research into the alternative press while Ken has to sit here listening.
I love her, you do.
While I talk about it. But I want to thank you so much. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks so much to Wayne State University Press too, just for supporting all my research into the alternative press. I couldn't be more thrilled that the book is coming out from Wayne State and that I get to be here tonight to do this event in the place where it all began. So thanks so much to Grace Sarah and to Jakir Ahmed for organizing this, for organizing the exhibition, and everyone at Wayne Galleries who put in so much work to this event tonight. So I'm going to give you an overview of the press's acute critical importance to 20th century American art and letters. And I'm going to tell you, I'll tell you now, that the alternative press, founded by artist and poet Anne and Ken Mikolowski in Detroit in 1969, is among maybe one of the most significant avant-garde print operations of the 20th century United States. I think Detroit already knows this. But tonight I want to talk specifically about one of the reasons why this is so. And this has to do with the press's intensively collaborative praxis. One that mixed art with life and life with art. One that blended and bended art and poetry. One that blurred the boundaries of authorship in the service of collective creativity. So I'll introduce/reintroduce you to the press and then talk through some examples of how their collaborative creations came into being and how we can understand the significance of their work, their aesthetic labor. Okay, so between 1969 and 1999, the press published distinctive print objects that included postcards, broadsides, bumper stickers, bookmarks, and the occasional bifold pamphlet and full-length book. You can see some of these upstairs. Publications were generally released in small editions of 500, which the Mikolowskis printed themselves and mailed out to subscribers in manila envelopes. Anne and Ken Mikolowski, very cool in this picture, both Detroit natives, met as teenagers and married in 1961. The couple established the alternative press 8 years later on Avery Street after purchasing a 1904 Chandler and Price hand-set letterpress from friends and collaborators in the Detroit Artists Workshop. The press also arose out of other existing collaborative networks in the city. For instance, as a student at Wayne State, Ken edited the literary magazine, The Wayne Review, where he published Detroit poets, including future alternative press contributors like Faye Kignosway, and other poet publishers from the city, such as Dudley Randall, who founded Broadside Press. Anne Mikolowski, also a Wayne State alumna, is known for her miniature portraits of the couple's poet friends. Measuring only a few inches in height and width, and you can see these upstairs, they're much bigger on the screen here. These portraits are a record of the informal exchanges that animated the alternative press and their collaborative energies. As Anne told the Detroit Metro Times in 1998, quote, "The thing about the portraits is that there are stories with everyone, and if I talk about the paintings, it's mostly about the people that I painted." So here are Bei Dao and Kofi Natambu, and Natambu was also an alternative press contributor. So this impact that Anne talks about, the impact of people, of friends, also inspired the work the Mikolowskis did with the alternative press. All of their work is highly collaborative, but the subsection of their publications known as the multiple originals are perhaps the most collaborative of all. This initiative, which saw poets and artists creating sets of 500 unique handmade postcards for the press, started in 1971, and the story of its development speaks to the circuits of influence that would become a hallmark of the alternative press and its pattern of collaborative making. Ken describes how Gordon Newton would come to our house, his house, and we do lots of collaborations. He said he wanted to do a drawing for us, so we had a stack of postcards, maybe 20 postcards, and he started doing drawings. And he said, no, that's not it, let me do another one. He's done a dozen, and I said, Gordy, you may as well keep going. You only have 488 more to go. That's how the 500 postcards started. So Ken's improvisatory invitation to Newton is one situation among many in which the alternative press generated ideas, as well as their material outcomes, from a relational model of creativity that involved multiple people working together. The completion of 500 postcards, a monumental feat, became for many contributors a community or family affair. Poet Alice Notley, who did 1,000 originals herself, writes about her husband, the poet Ted Berrigan's alternative press originals, as being, quote, haunted by other people's lines, lines by dead greats, and lines by Berrigan's friends, who were often invited to write a few words on the cards. So this is an example where Bernadette Mayer provided the first few lines as a prompt, and then the rest was written by Ted Berrigan, and that's mostly what you see his handwriting there on the card, and then Alice did the paintings on the card. So the multiple originals invite collaboration by their form, but it was true across the board that the alternative press contributors often made work together. Even on the letterpress cards, the results of a given submission to the Mikolowskis were unpredictable. With the addition of Anne's artwork, press marks, font choices, and so on, alternative press publications nearly always took on additional, unaccounted for visual features by the time they emerged in the post as three-dimensional intermedia objects. We're not there yet. In turn, these objects, once sent out to subscribers, were often further embellished. Sometimes the poetry and artworks themselves would be altered by their recipients, who, becoming contributors, would send the pieces back to the Mikolowskis in collaged or modified versions to be recirculated in the future. So this is the case with the Donna Brooke postcard here that started out as a Robert Creeley postcard. Even in cases where this did not occur, alternative press postcards were used. They were written on, sent to friends and loved ones, bumper stickers were stuck to cars and scratched by other vehicles in parking lots. Bookmarks were placed inside of other texts. Broadsides were folded and mailed for the revolution, or sometimes just for love of art. And every bit of text, mark, tear, or stain an alternative press publication gathered in the world continued to contribute to these art-like objects, imbuing them with meaning as they went. Although the alternative press published in a number of formats, the postcard overwhelmingly predominates. When artists, poets, and printers pick up this form, they take advantage of what it offers. By comparison with other potential means of expression, like the book or the canvas, postcards arrive in incomplete form, awaiting further inscriptions, interventions, and creative input. It's clear from the archives that many people used alternative press postcards in the way they were intended. Donald Hall, for instance, reflected in correspondence that, quote, he believes in sending them out rather than saving them. And in a letter from 1994, Diane DePrima writes about alternative press publications as objects that, quote, enter immediately into the world again as defined by their use. Postcards are written on, drawn on, stamped, and sent off. Postcards also offer themselves to numerous anonymous, unsuspecting reader collaborators as they move through the world. Their design allows them, as Jacques Derrida writes, to fall into all hands. This is true of the vast majority of alternative press publications, which were unbound and open-faced, but postcards, because they travel by mail without any further cover, can pick up incidental readers along the way, something Ken pokes fun at with his confidential postcard. In addition to their openness, postcards are distinctive because of the fact that they have two faces. As Derrida comments with postcards, one does not know what is front or what is back, here or there, near or far, the recto or verso. nor what is most important, the picture or the text, and in the text, the message or the caption or the address. In this jumbled, reversible, and de-hierarchized form, the reader has new power to decide and decipher which aspects of the card will be of most importance. This itself is a more intensely collaborative style of reading, and in the case of the alternative press's multiple originals, what features of postcards in general are become exaggerated. So for instance, many of the multiple originals are written by hand on their faces, rather than being machine typed or printed. This is true, for example, of Faye Kignoswe's cards, of Robert Creeley's cards. So one way of distinguishing the verso from the recto is that the typical site of handwritten inscription is on the back. This is not a reliable method in the case of the multiple originals. Likewise, although the Mikolowskis printed the cards with the expectation that collaborating poets and artists would compose their work on the opposite face, this didn't occur consistently. Ed Sanders' multiple originals, for instance, are often written directly onto the same side that the Mikolowskis printed, in the space where, on a typical postcard, one would expect to find a personal message. And the anticipated reader-collaborator is given the full blank front side on which to write, draw, paint, glue, or do nothing. And readers of the press's postcards often intervened into the postcards they received, taking on the role of co-author after the fact, and sending the postcards back out into the world for further distribution. This recirculative structure overlaps with concurrent activities developing under the rubric of mail art in the latter decades of the 20th century, so M-A-I-L, not M-A-L-E. There's plenty of M-A-L-E art going around. The most well-known mail art operators in the US are likely those, including the Mikolowskis, who were involved with Ray Johnson's correspondence, or sometimes called correspondence, school. Johnson is another Detroit native, but the correspondence school is based in New York. Still, because mail art used the mail and the mail was everywhere, it did not rely on or require consecrating art or poetry institutions based in major centers of cultural or economic activity in order to function. This is a point Mexican artist Ulises Carrion makes, writing that, quote, "There are centers of mail art activity in places where there are no art galleries, but only a modest post office." In fact, the alternative press's second location in Grindstone City, Michigan, did not even have its own post office. There, the nearest post office was 5 miles away in Port Austin. Even in Detroit, Ken and Ann went to a specific post office on Ford Street that was open until 9 p.m. because they needed its collaboration to do their large volume of mailing at times when the offices would be less crowded. Sita Peña Gangadaran describes how mail art can be understood as, quote, "a cultural form that involved a relational aesthetic well before digital technology made networking and virtual community possible." Such relational cultural forms, including the alternative press model, relied on exchange, not just distribution. This meant that artwork circulated amongst those involved in the network, and that the network participants had opportunities to receive, as well as to contribute, to send, to modify, and send on again. For example, Ray Johnson employed a mail art practice he began in the 1960s called on-sendings. These were, as Miriam McKinley writes, quote, "situations where participants received a letter or object in the post, added or subtracted from that item, and then mailed it on again to another participant." Here, and in the case of alternative press postcards, the fact that the postcards remained open for use by non-artist, non-poet, and non-professional writers of all kinds allowed for a slippery and malleable boundary between who was and wasn't considered the card's author. For example, in a handwritten letter to the Mikolowskis from Buffalo in 1989, Robert Creeley first proposes a potential poem entitled Moral. He types the poem into his letter in lineated form, drawing a rectangle around it to show how it might eventually appear. The poem then begins to take new shape inside the alternative press's network. First, it moves from Creeley's note onto a letterpress postcard, typeset and printed by Ken and Ann in Grindstone City. They select a serif typeface for the poem on the card's front and a press mark to indicate where to place the stem on its rear face. They print it on various colors of cardstock, including a grayish tan and brown, and they send it out to subscribers. Some of these subscribers go on to use the card as a regular postcard, or even as an on-sending in the style of Johnson's Provocations to be modified and returned. This includes Kenward Elmsley, who went on to create an erasure poem from Moral, secondarily entitled Oral. Elmsley then mails this card back to the Mikolowskis in 1992 at their then address in Ann Arbor. Here, as in Johnson's on-sendings, the artwork travels from Creeley through the Mikolowskis to Elmsley as the recipient, through Elmsley as its new co-author, and back to the Mikolowskis as both erasure poem and regular postcard. The back reads, "Hi Ken, love Kenward." As Brian McHale indicates, erasure is, quote, a recurrent topos of postmodern poetry, end quote, that begins to appear in the late 1960s, coinciding with the alternative press's launch. For erasure poetry, various strategies, blacking out, whiting out, removing through digital or analog means, cutting, are used to create a new poem from an existing text. Erasure poetry generally follows the order of words as established in the source text, but through excision and selection, generates a new work out of the old. This trend of intervening into a pre-existing work of art is not unique to poetry alone, and has a longer aesthetic history in the wider arts. This act that McHale calls, quote, part vandalism, part homage, end quote, was understood as part of a broader move toward dematerialization in the visual arts. Curiously, within poetry, erasure is generally thought of on opposite terms, as an appeal toward materiality, or as a material intervention into a poem that disrupts and calls attention to the materiality of all writing. It is also a kind of material intertextuality that, in spite of what the term erasure might suggest, typically doesn't completely override one author's presence with another, but rather makes use of opportunities for communion across distinct texts, authorial interfaces, times, and places. If Creeley's poem is immoral, Elmsley responds with a playful but serious interrogation of how morality is structured and wielded. The most significant changes Elmsley introduces are the change of title, and in line 2, the change of as in to sin. Elmsley's title, when read no further, looks a bit like salacious vandalism of the kind teenagers might do, changing a letter here and there until a perfunctory sign says something about sex. But the other changes Elmsley introduces suggest a more somber tone. This card was mailed back to the Mikolowskis in 1992, and the AIDS crisis, along with the so-called moral majority, is a specter. In these years, losses came at an unrelenting pace. Elmsley's partner, the artist, writer, and alternative press contributor Joe Brainerd would die of AIDS-related illness only 2 years after this card was mailed. A potential reading of sin in Elmsley's second line is that it could refer to woe in the same line, where the poem signals a kind of offense of grief, the inexorable I in the face of pain that just takes and takes. Alexandra J. Gold argues that erasure poetry, quote, might function as a powerful queer aesthetic strategy, authorizing subjectivities and poetic modes that have long been excluded from official literary and cultural traditions, end quote. In Elmsley's poem, erasure not only indexes this queer in/exclusion, but formalizes the losses suffered during AIDS' most acute era. As a counter to a dematerialized reading of such erasures, this poem can be read as using silence and lack as tools to materialize and commune with additional authors who have not had the chance to contribute to this poem or to poetry, authors who are gone. Looking back at Creeley's poem, it's not impossible to see traces of a related message in Moral, although there are basically no specific markers of a larger socio-political context on which to hang an interpretation. It presents as a more abstracted and depersonalized short poem. And many of the latent aspects of the poem come out more strongly in Elmsley's Erasure, which introduces references to sex, self, and sin as the inevitable byproduct of any structuring of the moral. In this way, Elmsley's Erasure both generates a new poem from a previous poem, and in addition to the erased voices that it materially marks, speaks among both poets, Creeley and Elmsley at once, something that the alternative press's correspondence structure and network makes possible. In this network, open collective rearticulation is also evident in more traditional poetic devices like intertextuality, that foreground the fundamentally collaborative energies alive in all texts. But here too, a common poetic device is concentrated in the hands of the alternative press. For instance, one of Jim Gustafson's multiple originals generates a poem that consists almost in its entirety of humorous intertextual reference to Allen Ginsberg, the alternative press contributor that we heard a bit about in the introduction already. Gustafson's growl replays part of the opening line of Ginsberg's Howl for a Joke. The two versions are, Ginsberg, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, and Gustafson, I've seen the best minds of my generation ruined by their terrible personalities. Or personities, as it is written there. I think I meant to say personalities. Gustafson's postcard was penned in 1994. By then, Ginsberg's poem would have been so famous as to have been often misquoted, memed, or rearticulated. Gustafson joins this chorus of voices with a satirical, poetic take of his own that reveals the true ruiner of great minds. Not abjection, not addiction, or crises of mental health, but terrible personalities. A couple of other minor changes are introduced. So he says, I've seen in place of I saw, and ruined in place of destroyed. Both poems also carry a dedication. Ginsberg's to Carl Solomon, whom he met at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and Gustafson's to Ken, he met in Detroit. Gustafson's short poem on the face of this card is maybe 100% intertextuality. Every piece of it is constructed in reference to Ginsberg's famous line, with Gustafson's changes injecting just enough difference to make the poem something new, but not. In this way, the poem inevitably issues from the two poets at once. Both poems, in fact, play with this notion of a split personality. Ginsberg's sees minds destroyed by madness, a product of the mind, perhaps. Gustafson's rewrite makes the same move, but with minds and personalities. We are our own undoing, both poets suggest. This implication extends to any subject purporting to operate as a sufficient self. From the perspective of the Gustafson poem especially, this split subject matter is matched with the doublespeak of the poem's intensely intertextual construction, leaving a trail of collaborative selves in its jokey wake. The back reads, howl, growl, the next is disembowel, and includes a drawing of what looks like a staircase viewed from the side. Here, the initial intertextual humor of the front side steps up toward a darker image of human turning animal and then eventually inside out, a total breakdown of self and subjectivity that takes place inside of just 3 rhyming words. Julia Kristeva writes about, quote, the word as minimal textual unit, end quote, a point where dense intertextualities present themselves. She argues that, quote, any text is constructed as a mosaic of quotations. Any text is the absorption and transformation of another, end quote. This assertion, which undermines the out-of-nowhere autonomy of the isolated author figure in his creations, is on display in Gustafson's concise poem. There, Gustafson frames the word and its rhyming echoes as a privileged site for authorial confluence by way of intertextual reference. And this happens actually across the whole of the alternative press's catalog, in visual form as well. Images repeat across the press's publications, from floating clouds added by the Mikolowskis to different prints, to bunny rabbits that appear across a series of postcards by Donna Brooke, to the bison that served as the press's mascot. Looking at the alternative press's whole catalog, what we see is a constant collaborative conversation in which every participant is talking to and influenced by others, and every author is a holding place for a prism of creative activity, and every publication is a referential mosaic of others. Radiating out from its center in Michigan, the alternative press built a collaborative network like none seen in late 20th century US arts and letters. Though part of a nationwide wave of small press poetry publishers, the alternative press remains a unique entry in this bibliography. No publisher published poetry in ephemeral, useful forms to the extent that the alternative press did. No other press was as intensely dedicated to fusing poetry and visual art in its print materials as the alternative press was. And no printer produced the range of unique objects that arose as a result of its multiple originals initiative. For the breadth of their output, the novelty of their publications, and their wide network of near and far collaborators, the Mikolowski's alternative press stands out.
Yeah.
Thank you, Becky. And listen, it's very flattering. It's all true. Now,
So you had some images you wanted to talk through with the audience, yeah?
well, I could do that, but a little more.
Can you hear Ken?
Can you hear me now? You can hear me, can't you? No. All right, I can do that, but that's sort of.
No, Mike's gonna stay right here.
All right. We started the press in 1969. We had never printed before in our life. Never. We were entirely self-taught. We made a lot of mistakes. And somewhere along the line, we finally learned to print. But it was a real process. The labor of love, with the accent clearly on the labor part. Letterpress work is, you set every word, every letter, one at a time by hand. We did, then you print them, put each piece of paper into the press, one at a time by hand, and you take the next one out. If you print 3 or 4 colors, you gotta do it every single color. If you have 500, you gotta run it through like 1,500 times with the press by hand. One in, one out. It was a labor of love, for sure. That's the background. Okay, now you want me to talk about other poems? Yeah?
Yep, talk about some.
I can't do this and show them up. When we got poems from people, they had no idea what we were going to do with them. Whether it was going to be a postcard, a bookmark, a bumper sticker, whatever. Some people asked for a bumper sticker, for example. We did that, but when they sent it to us, we just printed them. We just decided what color paper we'd use. Here's a poem of Eileen Miles that she sent us to us. You got that one? Okay. I want to read it anyway. It's called Spider Cider. Glasses on so I can see. There are people I would like to blow away, and others I think should live. Let her live, I thought, thinking about you. She'll have such a lousy time. So we had to do this, figure out how to do it. So we put it as a Valentine. A little heart on the back. But it somehow seemed appropriate. You know? Eileen loved it. Then Ron Padgett sent us a poem, and I'm not even going to read it, but I'll flash it at you. You see this? It's called 4 Caribbean Songs, and Ron hated it. He said, that looks like cheap vinyl diner upholstery.
It's got its charms.
It's charming. We liked it. We liked it fine. So that's an example of what sometimes people liked and what sometimes they didn't like. Here is a poem of Bob Hershot, which you saw it there already. I want to read it because I love this poem. It's somehow very appropriate. We wrote this, we did this in the early 70s. Ichabod. Everyone's first name means beloved of the Lord, or bearer of glad tidings, or valiant in battle. Except Ichabod, which means the glory has departed and must be considered the name for the future, along with the liar is thriving, unbearable cruelty, and the shitheads are running the show.
I actually have a story about this one because I posted this on social media
Yeah.
for reasons recently. And someone found it because they had just been looking up Robert Hirschhorn and like searching for things. And they wrote that they found it and they thought that he must have written it right now. But they looked it up and yeah, it's from sometime in the 70s. We printed it at Grindstone City, so I'm not exactly sure what date because you've never dated any of these cards. But we've got a range.
I like to make things difficult for all the bibliographers and all that. Robert Creeley, for example, did 500 original postcards, which he numbered and signed each one. And they're all different. Whoever has that poem, some of you might have that poem, you're the only copy of that poem in existence. When Bob's bibliographer wrote to me asking me to, Bob's crazy to do that. You have to make copies of every one of these so that won't be lost. Come on, we didn't do that. Bob was later interviewed in an American Poetry Review in which someone asked him, how much did they pay you? And Bob said, if they'd paid me, I wouldn't have done it.
Yeah, you see that in the archives. Loads of people writing to you. They're very enthusiastic about the 500 postcards to start, and then you start seeing these apology letters come in. Like, I sent 30, I'm working on the next 30, but it's going to take a while. Some people found it really generative, other people, it was a struggle. I mean, it's a monumental effort, yeah.
Well, it was. For some people, it was totally liberating, and for others, it was totally constipating. It was, the fact that you had to do 500 of them. Ed Dorn, another poet, did about 40 of them, and he said, I can't do any more. That's it. 40 was all there were.
But most of those 40 that he did ended up being included in his collection Abhorrences, which came out in the 1980s. And the introduction to that collection talks about how he suddenly shifts to this new sort of short form style. But they never mention the alternative press, and it's absolutely working with the press and in that postcard format that pushed him to start writing these very, very brief, sardonic kind of poems that were in the style that you tended to cultivate. Yeah.
What we created was sort of a product of our warped minds. So we had that going on. When we started the press, Ann was an artist, and I was a poet, and we started a press that printed art and poetry. So we found 3 different ways to not make a living on what we did. And that was true. The press never really made any money. Luckily, we were able to do all the labor ourselves, so therefore it wasn't a labor cost. The only cost was paper and postage. That was about it. We did the work ourselves.
But time too. I mean, if you haven't had experience with letterpress, I mean, you were starting to get it across, but I started letterpressing a bit as part of my research for this project to just kind of get my hands on the machines. And to set a postcard like this, I mean, I'm slow because I'm new to this. That might take me 2 hours.
Well, it took me 5 hours.
And so, you're right, like, I mean, you devoted incredible amounts of time to this project, I mean, and they charged only $10 a year for these subscriptions that you'd get 3 or 4 packets a year of these original materials. And then you started getting letters from bookstores in New York that were saying, hey, we'd love more of those Allen Ginsberg original rare pressings that they were selling for a lot more, and you can find them now on rare book sites for hundreds of dollars.
Yeah, when Gary Snyder came to town, we printed a couple poems of Gary's, maybe 3 pieces of his, and Gary said, I just saw that poem online, and it was $250. Got any more of them?
Some people too, they started the series and then they felt that the work they were making was too precious to give away. So Joe Brainerd, for instance, started a series of postcards, but then he was invited to show them at the Fishbach Gallery in New York in the 1970s, and so he says, I'm sorry, but they're going to the gallery, and most of them went there. Let me send you some of them.
Yeah, I got about a dozen of them. The rest of them were all sold at the gallery. Yeah, well, that's the way that goes.
Yeah, I mean,
We
you
didn't know
can
them.
understand, yeah, of course. But I think part of what I've been interested in the book is that you had this basically huge influence across all kinds of artists and poets all around the country that hasn't really been called out before. So Brainerd's paintings that were sold that started as a collaboration with you, or Doran's poems that suddenly changed style thanks to the influence of your kind of print formats and the style of the press. Lots of other, you've got Berrigan's A Certain Slant of Sunlight there, yeah.
I'm going to talk about one more poem first, and then I can put these away. This is a poem of Jim Gustafson's, and it's got a drawing of Anne's jukebox on it, and it goes, "When I die, I just want a jukebox for a tombstone, and to leave all my friends rolls of quarters." And so, that's about as warm and fuzzy a poem as you're going to find anywhere. Now, I got something I want to read to you. Ted Berrigan did his postcards. He and Alice got their postcards at the same time and became sort of competitive sport with them. Ted had 500, Alice had 500, and anybody who walked in the door, believe me, they lived right in St. Mark's Place. Everybody walked in their door. Ginsberg, Bernadette, Eileen Miles, all poets and artists came in, and they all had to collaborate with them. Okay, just write a couple lines, Bernadette. Okay, do this, do that. But they were an amazing collaboration themselves. And then Ted finished his postcards in April of 1973, and he died on the 4th of July.
I think
So-
it was 82.
What?
I think it was 82. 82, I think.
No,
Because he's got some that are dated
I
later.
don't think so. You may be right. Oh, I know. Anyway, Ted finished his postcards, and then he died. So we now know what killed him. Yeah. Here's one of his poems that sort of explains the process. It's called Eureka. And here's what it looks like. I left the bookstore, stunned and giggling. Between Baudelaire and Bateman, my books in print took up nearly a foot. I walked several blocks to my car, glowing at having reduced the competition, not to mention John Ashbery and John Berryman. After all, how many Johns does one poem need? To mere forlorn, lonely manifestations of the lame, the limp, the loud, and one night got in. Put it in reverse and backed up a block and a half. I was home. I, having a car in Manhattan. Now home, stretched out on the bed, I'm working on number 233 of my next work, 500 American postcards. Now I stop to do this one, number 13 today. Oops, wait a minute. Will this fit on a postcard? Joseph Conrad, here I come. So yeah, that's what they looked like when he did them. And this book was all done. It's his final book. It came out after his death. It all contains all sorts of postcards.
Yeah. Alice Notley writes about those, how the shape of the postcards became a constant size and form that he was writing into, and it also affected the poetry that he was making. So she said, like, if you got the handwriting very, very small, you could maybe get 16, 20 lines, but for the the most part, these were shorter works. And it's interesting because actually, after he ran out of the cards, Ted Berrigan printed up a bunch of like flimsy, fake alternative press cards, and he wrote like a postcard by the alternative press on it. And I think that speaks to the ways that like really the work that you were doing, it wasn't just incidental, like it wasn't just bringing out these other important poets, but actually you were this like really deep collaborator with people, influencing the types of things they wrote, the shape of the form of their work, and then even inspiring them to make their own faux alternative press, their alternative press.
Yeah, it was incredible. Well, when Ted and Alice got their postcards, they each did they're all 500. But after Ted's death, at the wake, at the Poetry Project in New York, Alice asked me if we print 500 more for her because she said that was such a great project they did together. It's what they did together, and she now wanted to continue that. So she ended up doing 1,000 original postcards, and they're really elaborate, many of them with drawings and paintings and things on them, handwritten. They're just amazingly well done, and most of them are mourning Ted's death, mostly about Ted's death. They're amazing series.
Yeah, I mean, Nick Sturm, who writes about the New York School, he writes about Alice Motley taking up collage and painting at this time in her life, and it's exactly what you see on the cards. So I don't know if that started before or after the cards, but again, like you really see the press's influence.
It was good to do that.
Yeah.
It was great to be able to be a part of that. We really didn't do it. I mean, we really didn't. I'm kind of not very modest about it because it's a project that Random House could never do. Simon & Schuster, not a chance. Who else could? We didn't do it either. The poets and artists did it, but we found the fast, easy way to print. We just printed the back of the postcard, that was it. Turned them over to them, 500. They had to do all the rest of the work. We just sat back and did nothing.
I don't know, you did quite a bit. Can we talk about one of yours? Bumper sticker?
Which one?
Grindstone City, the little town with a great future behind it.
It's true. That did not endure to the locals.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because we talked mostly about the postcards, and obviously in my presentation I was interested in how they circulate, how they're real objects in the world, more people contribute to them. But bumper stickers are obviously a really apt form for a press from the Motor City. This one's really interesting to me, and it's prescient too. I mean, because obviously Grindstone City, it was named after the grindstone,
Sure.
natural grindstone that was there. But by the 1970s, when you were living there, natural grindstone had been replaced in the marketplace by synthetics that were much easier to manufacture. And so all of the quarries and things in Grindstone City were abandoned, and basically the last of it was put on the National Historic Register. It was no longer active. So this huge industry there in Grindstone City, as you point out, and the bumper sticker was behind it, right? But this was prescient in a way to some of the other sort of changes that were taking place, I think, in late 20th century capitalism around the auto industry and labor, and I wonder if you had thoughts about sort of this bumper sticker being out there circulating in these spaces, kind of indicting some of the changes to economics at the time.
Well, we had a number of bumper stickers that I thought were, like Ed Sanders did one, defund.
Defund the right?
Defund the right, yes. I'm sorry, I blew that one. We did so many interesting bumper stickers. One of Creeley's, which Dennis loves, loves this one. Had to actually dig up an extra one in order to give it to him. He put one on his truck, and it was damaged on the back of his truck. So I had to give him an extra one. I hope he kept that one.
I got it.
Is that I Saw Delight?
Yeah. How is Hank Williams? I saw the light.
So I read actually in the biography of Hank Williams that he actually, although that's like a born again anthem, he actually, the lyric came from, he was like drunk in the back seat and his mother was driving him home from a concert. And there was like a landmark that they passed on the way back, like an airfield, I think, that was really really lit up. And so they knew they were getting close when they passed this bright airfield, and apparently he woke up from his slumber and said, I see the light, or whatever, and then it became this anthem. But it's funny because Creeley's card, I don't have an image of it with me, unfortunately, but it's in this like phosphorescent, bright, neon yellow. And so it's bringing the sense of like the literal light, right, back into the delight of the poem, and shifting it, it goes from this actual lights to the light of like rebirth, and then back to lights with Creeley and headlights.
Hank Williams was one of my first heroes. I think I was 13 when he died. And he died, as you probably know, at the age of 29, in the back seat of his limo with the driver driving him to his next show. And he said to the driver, when he got in the car, he said, "Just drive, man, just drive." And he died in the back seat. And the driver just kept driving to eternity.
Can you talk about the image in this? Because obviously it's someone with a nose to a grindstone. But in the, did Anne make that, or you found it?
That's a found image. Found image. Anne made a lot of things. A lot of things were just printer's dingbats, things that we found randomly. In fact, Gordy Newton, who I collaborate with a lot, Gordy is the one who found the bison, which is our press symbol. It came out of a print shop. It had been a tobacco label at one point. We adapted the bison because we sort of had the idea that we were resurrecting a lost art, letterpress. And now letterpresses are everywhere. They're very popular now. At the time we did it, resurrecting a lost art.
But I mean, the selection of these images is really clever, right? Because obviously, if there is no grindstone to nose, then you can't put your nose to the grindstone.
You
It's
shoulder the grindstone.
well, maybe. There's this like anti-bootstraps message there in the juxtaposition of the image and the grindstone city, that like you have to have grindstone if you're going to put your nose to the grindstone.
If you've ever been to Grindstone City, there's a huge, right across from our house, there's a huge, big grindstone. And it's, we had photos taken of our noses to the grindstone. Anne on one side, me on the other. I also want to mention for sure that you do understand that Anne was every bit a part of the press as much as I was. I mean, she did everything, including things that I didn't do. Like she did the artwork. She carved wood engravings, did lino blocks. I guess I did my part because I did the correspondence, which was really not easy when you have to write to your heroes. You have to write a decent letter to Creeley, or you got to write a letter to Gary Snyder or Diana Prima. These are all people I had to be in correspondence with. Anne didn't do the correspondence, but she did lots of other things too. We both set the type, we both did the printing, we both did everything, except gotta keep that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, you did receive an incredible amount of correspondence. I've read it all, and there's lots of great gossip in there, so I recommend going to the archive at the University of Michigan if you love 50-year-old gossip, which who doesn't? So we talk about this one, because one of the other things I was struck by in my research is that you operated from 1969 to 1999. And during those 30 years, people grew up. So you see people start out as young poets, you see a lot of people worrying about money, then people getting married, people having families, people moving in and out of relationships from one city to another. And so this is from the last decade of your printing, the 1990s, from Hetty Jones, Song at 60, "If you want to know me, you better hurry." I wonder how you might think about the press as changing over the years, or how it responded to different times or different moments in people's lives.
I have no idea. Well, okay, you want to know something that I'm not sure I can answer?
Right.
How did, well, let's just say that when I was a student at Wayne, I was part of a group of poets, Jim Gustafson, Faye Kicknosway, and Andre Kudrescu and Donna Brooke. We were all a group of poets. We were local people. We wanted to I was doing, along with John Sinclair, I did the Wayne Review, published Sinclair and George Tish and Robin Langley. And we all knew we wanted to, we were, not modest, we were all as good as anybody else anywhere. We all knew that. And so we wanted to do some publishing, get our local people out. And we did that until we started doing local people. And then along came Ginsburg and stayed with us for a week to raise money for the John Sinclair Defense Fund. He stayed at the house for a week and he left us a poem. And that just sort of changed everything. Alan put us on the map. He did. And I don't know that he just stayed in touch with us for a long time afterwards, gave us new poems to print all the time, until finally, one day, I went out to lunch with Alan 6 months after his death. True. Bill Morgan, his biographer, Bob Rosenthal, his longtime secretary, brought Alan's ashes to Ann Arbor, where they were installed at Jewel Hart Buddhist Center. And there's now a shrine there. 1/3 of Alan's ashes are in the plot in New Jersey, his family plot. 1/3 is at Naropa Institute out in Boulder, Colorado. And the other 1/3 is in Ann Arbor.
Mm.
There Alan is, and I went out to lunch with him afterwards.
Since you were talking about some of the others, you were involved with like Sinclair, which we'll get to in a second, but also others around the artist workshop, and obviously Anne was a painter, and you were a poet, but there were a lot more artists involved and a lot more arts, and it seemed like, you know, we saw the painting earlier of Kohinatamu, and here you published one of his poems. I think this is one of your earliest publications, is that right? This looks, because before the Grindstone, you started putting more information on later, like about Grindstone City, and here it just says the Alternative Press. So this is probably 1970 or so?
Late 70s.
But so this is a poem for the saxophonist Sonny Rollins, and it really, really leans into rhyme. You know, so when Sonny stands in for the moon, we hear such a glorious tune. It's always a hit of a swoon when Sonny stands in for the moon. And I just was curious about how the alternative press kind of fit in with the wider multimedia arts that were being made in your community, in the Cass Corridor, with your friends in Detroit. If you could say a little bit more about intermedia infusions.
No.
There's lots of it there.
We just did what we did. Really, that is how most things happen. We had no idea, we had no plan in advance. We just did it. And now, you're doing it.
Now it's up to me to tell everyone the narrative about how important and really pathbreaking it was. So here, we'll look at this last poem. It's called The Alternative Press. This is a poem by John Sinclair that he published while he was incarcerated in Marquette, so in the Upper Peninsula, which, you know, if you don't know the story, like, he was arrested for possession of 2 joints, a very small amount of marijuana, but sentenced to 9.5 to 10 years in prison, but it was politically motivated.
He served 2.5 a hard time. Jackson and Marquette, he served.
Yeah, they sent him back to Jackson, and he was in solitary confinement at Jackson after he tried to work with Black inmates at Marquette to set up a Black Studies program. And he was an anti-racist, leftist organizer.
John, a leftist?
Jan was very alarmed by Sinclair. So the police and the FBI too were really intensely tracking him. But so this poem, I got the chance to talk to John about this right before he died, only like a month or 2 before he died, about a year ago now. And it's about you, but it's really fascinating because he ties the work that you're doing, you and Anne at the Alternative Press, with these major movements in like third world Marxism and the the Black Panthers and the White Panthers that Sinclair co-founded. And I'm curious how we think about the role of DIY printing in difficult political times and what it might offer.
I should be writing the press again during this time. Although, well, almost everybody we publish is dead. So, what's your question?
I think my question is like, help us figure out what to do, right? How do we keep circulating? How do we keep networking?
Resist every possible moment. Just resist. And I don't know where it's, that guy has been president for 3 months now, less than 3 months. Look at what's been going on in those 3 months. Oh, I know some of you are about the other side, but.
Dictator from day one.
What's he gonna do in the next 8 years? He's gonna run again.
Promise kept.
Sinclair really credits you with a lot. I love the end of this poem. It says, and we will press that alternative in the face of whatever it is, would not have us free. We will press it until our lives themselves become the poem. It's great. Any questions out there on that note? The whole poem? Yeah, it says, and we will press that alternative in the face of whatever it is that would not have us free. We will press it until our lives themselves become the poem.